Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Friday, April 25th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, our tech commentary columnist, writing his column now, I don't know, is it 6 years?
I don't know if it's quite that long, but it's been a good run so far.
Yeah, it's been a good run, covering things from COVID to space to environmental regs to panics to how we interact as humans with the high-tech revolution. This is James B. Meggs. Jim, welcome back to the Commentary Podcast.
Great to be back.
So, Jim, you have a piece in the new issue, May issue of Commentary, that the subject of which we discussed, and in fact, that's one of the things that encouraged us to decide to do this piece, called Greenpeace Pays the Piper, which I think is an important moment in the discussion of the intersection of environmental activism and leftist activism and government action and private industry, in part because it does not implicate Trump, the Trump administration, executive orders, or anything like that. This is the story of a lawsuit that began in 2017 against Greenpeace, involving the laying of a fracking pipeline in the Dakotas, and how the efforts to stop it at the Standing Rock, if you remember that's the name of the reservation.
The Standing Rock Sioux Reservation.
Right. And the efforts to stop it then turning out to have been essentially ruled by a jury, by a jury of peers, as being a how would you describe it? I mean, not a conspiracy because it's not a criminal case.
Well,
but
it's a civil. Actually,
civil
of
case,
the various charges that were in this civil suit by Energy Transfer, the company building the Dakota Access Pipeline, included civil conspiracy, also defamation. Basically, they accused Greenpeace of funding some of the most radical elements in this months-long protest, in which, as is so typical of these kinds of protests, you had a lot of peaceful protests. In fact, the local tribe really tried to keep it peaceful, the Sioux tribe that started it. But then you had a lot of outsiders flooding in, including some pretty rough Antifa-style activists. And the charge was that Greenpeace was kind of under the table funding those people who pushed the protest to trespass, destroying equipment, blocking roads, threatening pipeline workers, things like that.
So the result of the lawsuit was a colossal judgment against Greenpeace that, should it stick at the dollar levels that the court determined, will bankrupt Greenpeace, which is, I think, the most venerable of the activist environmentalist organizations around the world, and which has been intermittently involved in these extra legal activities, famously a standoff in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean or something like that, with a French freighter that actually blew up a Greenpeace boat in the 80s.
Well, this is there's a great podcast called The Rest is Classified, and they did an episode on this. The French, I guess the French equivalent of their CIA, actually targeted a Greenpeace boat that was interfering with, I believe it was their nuclear testing in the Pacific. And so they actually went with some scuba divers and set a bomb to sink it in the harbor. I mean, it was an outrageous act of. I'm on Greenpeace's side on this one. It was an outrageous act, and I believe at least one person was killed. It was a huge.
It was shocking, but the thing about Greenpeace is that it is an activist organization, unlike a lot of environmentalist organizations. Believes in kind of a little bit like, by any means necessary, we need to halt these activities before they destroy the earth. A lot of American environmentalist groups use the law as it stands to do things like purchase land and therefore take it off the chessboard for development. They do things within, drawing within the lines, or using the fairly using pieces of American legislation like the Endangered Species Act or other things to achieve their aims, but all above board. And what was different about this energy transfer story was that in line with the change on the left, really beginning in 2015, I think, with Ferguson, Missouri, and others, this notion that it was time to go beyond respecting the niceties of the law to first principles, which is, the ends justify the means, and there's going to be no way to stop this energy transfer pipeline except by scaring the hell out of energy transfer, raising the cost to an unacceptable level for them to build it, and then maybe they would just abandon it or get rid of it. And this one CEO basically said, I'm not going there. Like, this is this is not the way the world is supposed to work. You don't get to come and intimidate me out of doing something that is A, what my company is about, and B, that doesn't follow any rule of law that we can possibly discern from your activities.
I mean,
Yeah, you've seen this movement for a while, what they call direct action. This is a very common phrase among the activist progressive left, meaning it's not enough to just talk about or protest something we don't like. We have to find some way to stop it, to put our bodies on the gears of the machinery.
Right.
And they'll often say nonviolent direct action, but when you dig into what they mean by direct action, they mean things like blocking highways and occupying buildings and often fighting police. So it often and typically does involve law breaking of some kind, sabotaging construction equipment, and this is an explicit goal that they have, and I think that what the energy transfer suit shows is it's very important to draw a distinction between legitimate legal protest and even even some forms of, let's say you go somewhere where you're not supposed to be and you get arrested, but when Martin Luther King did it, they got arrested peacefully. He said you had to be joyful, and you weren't fighting the police as you got arrested. You were making a point that the law was unjust, and therefore your arrest was unjust. You weren't throwing things at the police, or as I said on some interview I did, when Rosa Parks sat on the bus, she sat on the bus. She didn't firebomb the bus.
and there's also when you see the countless images of environmentalists sitting down on highways in front of trucks and whatever, they're basically daring drivers to hit them, to run them over. It's a provocation, that they're looking for. I mean, I'm sure they don't want to die, or maybe some of them do, but it's to the point where you can't even imagine that it hasn't happened yet. That someone hasn't just driven right through.
Well, so direct action has taken many forms over the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, some of the earliest forms of direct environmentalist action by the I think now disbanded group Earth Now, because I think a lot of people in Earth Now went to jail.
Our Earth First?
Earth First, excuse me. Thank you. Yeah, it was to spike trees, like to put hammer nails into trees so that when a logger came to cut the tree down, the saw would hit the nail and explode, or the tree would go up, or the logger would be injured or disabled by the confrontation of metal on metal.
At least certainly the chainsaw would be wrecked. Yeah,
right. And so that was one early form of direct action against like an individual employee of some large company, right? It wasn't his fault that he got hired to cut a tree down. And so if we move forward over the next 20 or 30 years, we have the adoption of these tactics outside the world of environmentalism, maybe starting with the G20 in 1999 in Vancouver, but moving forward to Ferguson, the kinds of provocations that, as Noah Rothman detailed in commentary in 2016, where leftist protesters would be attempting to draw Trump supporters or Trump rally people into fights, in other words, to create the conditions under which they would be attacked so that they could claim that they had been attacked. And then, of course, George Floyd 2020, and the mostly peaceful protests that involved setting, half of downtown Minneapolis on fire, and the like. So we have this world in which direct action, and I haven't even mentioned the big one, which of course is the encampments, which are now back at Yale and City College, and efforts to put them back up at Columbia, all of which existed as a provocation. Say we're going to do this patently illegal thing on our campus. Go ahead, make our day. Come arrest us. Come tear us down. Or saying to Jewish students, like vilely insulting. Yesterday in New Haven, or the day before yesterday, Jewish students were prevented from walking on campus yet again. Pathways on the greens were blocked off, and people started throwing water bottles at them, literal water bottles at their heads. Obviously, that's a direct criminal action. That's assault. But the whole effort here is to create a riot, like that they're not just throwing them to throw them. They want the response, which I think is Abe's point, is it's not just enough to make your statement. And of course, there are many ways to peacefully protest Israel if you want to peacefully protest Israel. And there are many ways in which that peaceful protest is actually violent and involves the encroachment on the rights of other people, like to walk freely on public streets. And here we are. And this question of whether a civil society can allow or afford to allow these weird exceptions for leftist general action, where they get to do whatever it is that they want to do, claiming free speech or love of environment or something like that. And all of that is supposed to be a get out of jail free card, or a permission for anarchy card. And of course the media go along, and other activists go along, and the omni cause is furthered in this way. And that's why this suit against Greenpeace is so potentially like a pivot point, at least when it comes to private industry, because a lot of these things I'm talking about now, involve people doing this in places where the people who need to enforce the law are kind of on their side. University administrators, people like that, right? But
or DAs in cities like Minneapolis and New York and Oakland,
right,
Portland.
who don't want to prosecute these offenses. But here you have Energy Transfer, and Energy Transfer exists to build a pipeline, and this very rich, massive worldwide organization has decided to try to put its finger on the scale to make this as difficult as possible. And the company says, we don't have to take this. We don't have to let you do it. We're not political actors in a state worried about you voting us out of power. We have a fiduciary responsibility to our stockholders. This is how we make money. If we don't do it, we're going to go out of business. Sorry, we're going to come after you for everything you've got. And maybe we can present a precedent for others to do the same, so that the atmosphere changes in which a lot of these organizations have felt it possible to act with relative impunity.
I think one of the really key things here is just discovering how this all works. A lot of these organizations that fund these activist groups, they do it through various back channels and grants to other organizations. So, whether it's the Rockefeller Brothers, the Ford Foundation, these supposedly legitimate mainstream nonprofits are, if you dig down, the money is flowing here and flowing there. And in the case of Greenpeace, the process of discovery in the civil suit showed lots of emails and texts of how they were raising the money, what they were spending it on. One of the things they spent money on was these things called lock boxes. These are big PVC tubes, like heavy duty plumbing, with a thing inside that people can latch their hands to. So one person puts their arm in one side, the other person put their arm in the other side, and they create this kind of human chain that is very difficult without injuring people for the police to come in and cut open. Sometimes they wrap it in metal or concrete. So they sent all these lock boxes, 20 to 30 lock boxes, to the protests, and the protesters used it to attach themselves to heavy equipment and other things. So clearly it was abetting a particularly extreme form of trespassing, which would prevent the work from going forward, subject the police to an incredible amount of hassle. And as you say, I think sometimes there is the hope that along the way somebody will get injured, as the police are trying to cut these stupid things off these protesters. And that'll be a big victory for the movement. Look how abusive these jackbooted thugs are to our peaceful, nonviolent protesters.
I mean, Abe, I think people forget that I remember this very well because of my story of my son's bar mitzvah. My son's bar mitzvah took place on October 28th, 2023. So it was, 2-3 weeks after October 7th. And we had to go from Manhattan to Brooklyn for the party on a Saturday night. And the Brooklyn Bridge was shut down that Saturday night 21 days after October 7th. For a protest against Israel's monstrous behavior. And so it took people 2 hours to get to the party because the Brooklyn Bridge was 2 weeks, 3 weeks after October 7th. All over the country, people were shutting down highways, shutting down the I-5, shutting down the 110 in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And the purpose of these shutdowns was not just to have mass action. It was to encourage, as has been the case with a lot of this direct action, put enormous pressure on cops. Like one thing goes wrong and a cop gets, brushed, somebody's arm brushes a young cop who is already freaked out, and he turns around and takes out a truncheon and hits somebody, and then everything goes crazy. And the whole thing, this didn't happen, but the anxiety level that we subject our public safety officers to, who are then in the position of not only not protecting us against this trespass, but protecting themselves against being pushed too far and therefore becoming the subject of the crime rather than the enforcer against the crime that is being committed of the trespass. Like, it's just not fair. It's like fundamentally a horrible thing to do to these people who are like putting their lives on the line to protect public safety in the United States.
And it comes at a time where cops are already sort of wary of stepping in post George Floyd. The pro-Hamas protesters circulated pamphlets about how to draw cops in to a confrontation that would put them in jeopardy. It's interesting that all the various activist groups, the environmentalists, the pro-Palestinians, whatever it is, all their methods now have blended, right? Like they're all blocking highways and bridges and doing that, and their causes have completely blended as well, right? So you have Greta Thunberg protesting Israel, out there with her pro-Hamas garbage. So I'm curious, though, if this carries over to the paying the piper part, right? Like, does Greenpeace paying the piper? What is is there a sort of a broader effect here for the other groups because they are so intertwined? Does this send that message, or does it not, or is that sort of considered a separate? Are they
imagine
together up to
that
that
the
point?
Omni cause is the Death Star,
right?
And Greenpeace is the Greenpeace, the spot where if you shoot the little missile in from Luke's plane, you can take out the entire Death Star, right?
Nice.
Because there's this flaw in the organization. There's this one spot and flaw where if they are in fact all connected, and you hit one part of the omni cause, you start a chain reaction that destroys the rest of the omni cause.
If only it were that simple. It's probably more like the Borg, a loosely connected a network of semi-autonomous actors who are all unified in kind of a common cause and a common ideology, but you could segment off different parts and they would continue to function. So I don't think this is not going to be a one-shot thing. I think what we might see coming out of this is a growing awareness that the invulnerability that these groups have assumed. They've assumed that the press won't pay attention, that the courts won't pay attention to the ways that they are quietly or sometimes secretly funding illegal activity. That invulnerability is now threatened. So that might begin to change their behavior, but it will take more cases like this. There's another one down in Atlanta going on. It's a big RICO suit against a bunch of the people who organized in a very similar fashion against this planned police training center. They called the activist called Cop City. Stop Cop City. I followed this at the time. It was around 2020. It dragged on and off for a couple of years and still going on in some ways, where they used bolt cutters to break into the construction site. They claimed that not only were they fighting against police violence, because this was going to be a training center to train police to do militaristic policing, but they were also saving this so-called forest on this land that was owned by the city or the state, and had been it had been a prison facility in the past. So they pulled all these causes together. Well, I was doing a big article about Biden's environmental justice policies. One of the groups that they were funding is a climate group based in Oakland. And on their website, they have a big page devoted to Stop Cop City. And they had this charming little illustration of these kind of childlike activists who are going to save the planet and save the forest. And one of them is holding a pair of bolt cutters. So here's this group getting federal funding supposedly for environmental causes, and they're celebrating the trespass and the violence that was taking place and encouraging people to help fund these activists who were attacking police and attacking burning construction equipment at this facility. And so, I think that RICO suit may, like the Greenpeace suit, drag a lot of information out. Who paid for these people to come and camp out in the woods for months on end? Who helped elevate this small local issue in the outskirts of Atlanta into a national, even an international cause? How do these networks work? If it, to the extent that it's speech, that's fine. People can decide and publicize something they're opposed to. But to the extent that it funded illegal activity, I think it really deserves to have a little daylight shown on it.
So we find ourselves in the middle of this giant rolling controversy involving the deportation on the plane of the Venezuelans to El Salvador, including one, of course, wrongly detained, wrongly flown out man, Abrego Garcia, an El Salvadoran national who had been provided with some form of asylum by an immigration court in 2019, meaning that from El Salvador on the grounds that he had a reasonable fear of persecution in El Salvador, meaning that he could have been deported to any country on earth except El Salvador, and they ended up putting him on the plane to El Salvador. And we now have this incredible set of confusions here, which is, are these people getting deported because of their views or because of this? And what about due process? There are important constitutional issues like due process, and then there are issues that are simple, like actual matters of law, which is that if someone here in the United States illegally is illegal and has not entered in any way, shape, or form into our system, by which I mean has any legal standing because they filed a suit or they filed an asylum claim or something like that. It is the policy of the government of the United States that that person does not exist within the borders of the United States and can be removed. And there is no due process per se, because as a matter of law, they are not present in the United States except as illegal actors. And therefore 15 million illegal aliens don't get due process unless they have sought some form of legal standing in the United States. If they have somehow put in a piece of paper that says they want to be here, and then they've been released into the country, as happened with millions of people under Biden, that standing may be a little different. But like basically the 230 people aside from Abrego Garcia who are on that plane do not have due process rights as we understand them. This is not we do not have a human right to due process, by the way. Like that Declaration of Independence doesn't say you have a human right to due process under law. We understand due process under law being a centerpiece of the rule of law. But in all of these cases, what you have is an assertion of rights, and the assertion of rights that all Americans take for granted that may not apply to some people. And like, you have a right to assembly, right? That's First Amendment. You have a right to speech. That's the First Amendment. You don't have the right to close a bridge down. That's not the First Amendment. You don't have a right to spike a tree because you care about the environment. That's not speech, and that's not assembly. That is vandalism. That is the depredation of somebody else's property. And common law says you can go to jail for stuff like that. Jim, moving on from this to one of your other favorite topics, which is space. Since we talked about the Borg and we talked about Star Wars, now we can talk about actual space. So you have just completed a remarkable paper for the Manhattan Institute called U.S. Space Policy: The Next Frontier. And this is a very interesting public-private question that you raise here, which is that we need to be thinking very seriously about the next 40, 50 years in space, particularly with China as our leading adversary, and that our governmental policy in space is very confused, and some of it is innovative and some of it is incredibly hidebound, and some of it is showing the way in the future, and some of it is based on bad old ideas that we need to discard. And so you lay out in this paper a particular project of NASA's that is, in your view, a huge hamper to getting on with what we need to be doing outside our outer atmosphere and with the moon and with space exploration in general. Can you tell us what that is and how it needs to be stopped?
Yeah, that's a very good summary, John. So for more than a decade, and in some ways for 20 years in different forms, NASA's been working on a giant Apollo-style rocket intended to facilitate missions beyond low Earth orbit. We really haven't been beyond low Earth orbit with astronauts since the days of Apollo. And it's really something, if you look back to, your and my childhoods, when we assumed that, by 2010, we'd have hotels on the moon and be sending deep, look at the movie 2001. If you want to see an image of what we thought the future was going to look like around, the 1970s. So
yeah, 2001 posits a manned mission to a moon of Jupiter.
That's right.
Right. That what they discover is this monolith on this moon of Jupiter. Like
the monolith is on our moon, actually.
The monolith is on our moon, but they are going to Jupiter. They are like
correct. Yeah. So, but you can take a Pan Am kind of space shuttle to the moon as a commercial flight, and those assumptions weren't crazy, but none of that happened. So today, we are trying to get back to the moon and then to Mars. And they've been building this giant rocket called the Space Launch System, SLS, and it's just a huge boondoggle. They've spent about 44 billion on this SLS rocket plus this Orion capsule, which is basically an oversized version of the Apollo capsule that carried our astronauts to the moon. And it's only flown once without any people on board. It's supposed to fly its second flight with astronauts on board next year to just make an orbit around the moon and come back to Earth. And then ultimately after that, hopefully a mission that will land Americans or a crew, an American and Canadian crew on the moon it will carry a crew to the moon, two of whom will go down to the surface of the moon. And so that's very exciting. The problem is it's so expensive that there's real doubts about how much this thing can do. The NASA's Inspector General estimates this giant rocket will cost over $4 billion each time it's launched. NASA's entire annual budget is only about $25 billion. So, you can just do the math and you can see they can't afford to fly this thing more than maybe once a year. And even then, it's an incredible waste of money. While NASA's been working on this project, they've also had this very innovative program called Commercial Crew that was started way back before the space shuttle retired in the aughts. There were people at NASA who were fed up with this slow-moving way of building space hardware. And they said, why don't we just charter rockets built by private industry the way that, a sports team or a rock band might charter an airplane. And it was a really innovative program. They put out some seed money to Boeing and SpaceX and other companies to develop the spacecraft that could carry first cargo and then astronauts to the International Space Station. SpaceX was the overwhelming kind of winner in that competition, and they've been flying cargo and astronauts to our space station routinely now for years, saving billions and billions of dollars in the process. It's so much more cost effective for NASA to hire these services instead of building and owning its own rockets. So my recommendation in this Manhattan Institute paper is, let's just get NASA out of the rocket building business. Let's shut down this SLS program and continue working with SpaceX primarily right now, but also Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin and other private companies, not just to build rockets and space vehicles, but to build space probes and all kinds of other things. The good news is there's a lot of people at NASA who want to do this. They've been fighting to do this for years. A lot of the problem is that Congress doesn't want them to do it. When the space shuttle shut down, there were all these workers and NASA programs involved in running that very inefficient program. So the senators from the states and representatives from those states really insisted that NASA build another rocket. In fact, they even demanded that it use components from the space stations, including those boosters. Remember the booster that blew up, that failed and caused the Challenger disaster. They had to use that. They had to use the same liquid fuel rocket engines and other components from the shuttle in order to keep those workforces working. It's a totally backwards way to build anything. It's mandated by Congress. So one of the challenges here is, how do we convince Congress to stop insisting on what in one article I've written I call a flying pork barrel, this SLS rocket, and let NASA focus on what it does best, which is research and mission planning and running missions, but hiring the hardware and working in public-private partnerships with these innovative private space companies to do the work of building and flying these vehicles.
And meanwhile, Jim, as you point out, so NASA is hampered by this boondoggle and by various restrictions and whatever sclerotic systems it has in place. China is not worrying about such things, right?
China is really on the march.
Right.
In space in all kinds of ways. They have a space station in orbit. They say they're going to land their taikonauts on the moon by 2030. They've taken a very aggressive approach to space. A decade and a half ago, they did the most destructive anti-satellite missile test in history, scattering debris all across low Earth orbit. They don't care what anybody else thinks. And it really is a threat. And I think this is an area where U.S. leadership is really important to establish a kind of, a standard of peaceful and careful exploration of space that doesn't litter orbit with dangerous debris and doesn't allow people to militarize space. There's a number of space treaties that we've helped pioneer, including under the first the first Trump administration, that encourage international peaceful cooperation in space. And in the first Trump administration, and we attracted a lot of other countries to want to work with us on our moon program and other things as part of this peaceful effort. I worry a lot of that is threatened by this more bellicose, chaotic second term, which seems to be sending the message that we not only do we not need our allies, we don't really even like them very much. So we'll see how that moves forward. But allowing China to get to the moon first, Texas Representative Bruce Babin says if China gets to the moon before we do, they're going to write the rules of the road up there. As we've discussed, there are a couple of places on the moon, especially the South Pole, that are especially attractive to setting up lunar bases. We don't want China to get up there and just dominate that terrain. That stuff has to be, I think, shared, kind of the way we share Antarctica for research for now. And so it's important that we do establish our right. It's kind of like the right to navigate in the oceans. We need to establish our right to navigate in space. And it doesn't mean China can't go there too, but we should be setting the rules of the road, I think, according to the traditions of free navigation that we've established so far, even in working with the Soviet Union and the Russians.
You do say, and I think it's important to point out that what you're not calling for, a sort of Doge-like immediate cessation of this project. You're saying we're building it. It's been built. Enormous amounts of money have been lost. Use it for 2 missions. If it's going to be active next year, you let it fly twice, and then retire it, because we're not going to go through this whole thing with nothing to show for it, and there are missions planned, and those missions should go forward. So you're not sort of like coming in and saying, "All right, let's just take a wrecking ball to this giant rocket."
Yeah, I mean, I would be happy to take a wrecking ball to it.
What? Well, I know.
I mean,
you're saying realistically,
but
the smart thing to do is to let it fly a couple of times and then move on from this misbegotten approach that was a terrible mistake. I am reminded, not because I have to go to my insane pop culture brain, that there was a TV movie and TV series in the late 1970s called Salvage with Andy Griffith, who played a very successful junkyard dealer in Alabama or Georgia or something like that, who gets his hand on some discarded Apollo stuff at his junkyard and decides to build a private rocket to go into space. And this is, I think, 1979. It was turned into a TV series for a season or something like that. And I've long thought that somewhere in the American consciousness, just as Star Trek created the generation of aerospace workers and inspired Bezos and Musk and people like that to like want to go to space, that show got into the heads of people of my age, or 10 years younger if they were 10 or 11 years old, and we're like, well, why can't I fly I could build a kit car Why can't I build a rocket to go to the moon? And it is kind of the question that you raise in all of the stuff that you write here about space, which is, why did we go this huge government way? Obviously, if you're Kennedy, you're going to say we need to go to the moon in 8 years, which is what he did. You can't then say, okay, we're going to go to the moon in 8 years. You all figure it out there. We're standing right behind you. That wasn't going to work. Certainly not in America in the early 1960s. But we took this terrible, top-down statist approach to this incredible innovation, as though that's the worst possible way to innovate, is to involve 535 members of Congress and an entire bureaucracy to do something fleet, clever, innovative, move fast, break things, try new things, all of that. And this is an opportunity to close the door on that era, the last of the top down. The government is going to build this thing, build it, run it, pay for it, do things that aren't realistically sound for political reasons, and go along with it.
Well, it worked for Apollo. It really hasn't worked ever since. The space shuttle was really a big disaster, not only because we had 2 horrific fatal accidents, but because it was just too expensive to fly frequently. So we've really, for 50 years, failed to build a reliable, affordable space transportation system. Meanwhile, SpaceX is the world's most successful launch company. They're bringing prices down by not just an order of magnitude, but we're approaching 2 orders of magnitude in cost reductions with their experimental new Starship that they're testing, and we expect to be the backbone of future Moon and Mars missions. So, rapid progress is possible, and when we look at what they're doing with Starship, and what they've done with the Falcon 9, which is their workhorse rocket in use really every few days right now. They're launching a couple of missions a week at least. So if we look at that, we can see just how slow and backward looking NASA's efforts have been. And again, I want to stress, there were many people at NASA who didn't want it this way. They were pushed into it by Congress, and they were trying to do something more innovative. NASA was actually proposing shutting down the SLS program under Obama, and trying to get that shut down so they could rely on these private vendors. So now we have an opportunity. Trump has nominated this guy, Jared Isaacman, who's really interesting and well-liked entrepreneur who has self-funded 2 really ambitious private space flights on SpaceX Dragon spacecraft, including one that involved the civilian spacewalk and a daring novel orbit over the poles, real space exploration, just privately funded. This is way beyond space tourism. And so he's had his confirmation hearing. He did pretty well in the confirmation hearing. I've got a piece up at City Journal if you want to read about that. He got a lot of pushback from Congress, from senators who want to make sure that the current program, which is called Artemis, isn't cut, and that a lot of them started by listing all the NASA programs in their states, and like, can you promise me that this division or that division will never get shut down? And he danced around those questions very well, I thought, and but he's almost certain to be confirmed. That confirmation may happen as early as next week. But he will have his work cut out for him, not only managing this massive transition at NASA, he's got to manage Congress and sort of sell them on retiring SLS. But he also has to manage the White House, which, as we've all seen, has this tendency to sort of cut first, ask questions later. They've already made a proposal to make some very broad and sweeping cuts to NASA's science program. These are the unmanned space telescopes and Mars rovers and other science missions. before Isaacman even gets in there to sort of manage the process, they're making his life more difficult by announcing all these sweeping cuts, some of which might be good. And we could cut some of these programs carefully, and I mean, there have been budget overruns in those programs too, which are outrageous. But give the guy a chance to use his entrepreneurial managerial experience to manage this, and don't just hand him a massive problem that he's got to cope with the minute he takes that position.
You've written 2 or 3 pieces. I can't even remember now, because you've written, I don't know, 60 pieces for commentary or something like that. But you've written 2 or 3 pieces about Elon Musk and the incredible complexities posed by Elon Musk, his personality, his approach to things. And I'm wondering, given your extraordinary respect for SpaceX and what it's done, and the kinds of things that it can do in the future, whether Musk's behavior over the last 3 months in turning himself into an incredible lightning rod figure of controversy, and somebody toward whom one of the 2 major political parties has now become a kind of tar baby for, and also a fundraising juggernaut, as the enemy of everything that's good and true and beautiful. And we know that Tesla, among other things, has lost vast amounts of value in the stock market over the last 3 months. Whether Musk's behavior at Doge and with Trump and on X, and this kind of unrestrained id person that he is, libertarian id in some fashion, whether that is going to do real damage to the larger cause, that is what will make him a legend in history, if he can in fact fulfill a lot of the ambitions that are properly what he should be engaged with, as opposed to like whether or not there should be 200 employees cut from this department or 400 employees cut from this department.
I worry about this a lot. And yeah, a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece about Musk's combination of engineering and entrepreneurial brilliance and personal kind of erratic behavior and impulsive behavior, and worried about the implications of it. I'm very worried about it for space policy. I get into it a little bit in my report, because for a long time, U.S. space policy has been an area of certain bipartisan agreement. I mean, Trump won a lot of bipartisan support for his space policies, including starting the U.S. Space Force, moving military operations to its own, under its own command, that were really quite popular and have endured. But now, if everything Musk touches is considered illegitimate, and if NASA becomes seen as sort of a fiefdom of Elon Musk, then you can imagine a future Congress, after the midterms, or certainly a future Democratic presidential administration is saying, okay, we're gonna shut down everything Musk built because it's all illegitimate. And why is the federal government subsidizing this guy with all this money? The fact is, the money that NASA pays SpaceX is such a good deal for taxpayers. It's ridiculous. But it's hard to give that message when the guy whose name is associated with it is kind of almost deliberately and with great enjoyment just trying to piss off everybody that doesn't already back him. So we've added this intense political valence to space policy where it didn't really exist before. That's going to make things a lot harder in the future, I worry. And I think, you already see people like Rachel Maddow saying the government just has to end all these contracts with all of Musk's companies. Well, that's Rachel Maddow, but you're going to see that opinion spread to others, and I think that this could really be a bad thing for U.S. space policy, because in many ways, for the moment, SpaceX is just about the only game in town for heavy duty launch services to low Earth orbit, and for some of the services we need to get to the moon. Blue Origin's coming along. There's the United Launch Alliance has some capabilities. There's other companies coming up, but nobody can touch SpaceX for just frequency of launches and reliability at this point. So if all of a sudden we back away from SpaceX, it means we back away from a manned space program.
And Musk has no room for error now with this stuff either, right? I mean, if the second, God forbid, something goes wrong, then it's really a pile on. It's like the crazy guy sleeping on the floor at the White House. Wow, who would have thought that his rocket would blow up or whatever? Of course, we got to get this guy out of serious things.
That's such a good point, Abe. And actually, there are people, including the pioneering blogger Rand Simberg, who's also a really good space analyst who wrote for me at Popular Mechanics and who I always talk to on these issues, who argue that we've tried to make the space program too safe. And we have to accept more risk. We have to accept that, it's possible to send a mission to the moon and they don't come back. If you look at the history of exploration in humanity, these explorers were willing to take on enormous risk. If we're really serious about moving quickly, we have to understand that there are people who are willing to do that. And that's, I'm not saying we want to be reckless, but we need to tolerate a certain amount of risk. And you see that SpaceX, in developing their technology, they're willing to launch these starships and watch them blow up, and get the data and learn from it, tweak it, and then just launch it again 2 months later, rather than saying, oh, we had a problem, we need to stop for 2 years and work on it till we're positive the next launch is going to go flawlessly. By moving quickly and tolerating and learning from failure, that's how they've advanced so fast. But if that happens in a NASA mission, you're absolutely right. The blowback from that would be intense.
Look, the Apollo program, which I think, I believe the dollar amount in current dollars for the Apollo program, which lasted for 13 years, approaches $1 trillion. It was something like $2,000 per American in 1970 dollars for us to get to the moon. And one of the reasons that the program died the minute started to die, and then died like 5 years later, the minute we got to the moon, which is that was the goal. The goal was achieved, and then convincing people that we needed to keep going back to the moon to dig up more rocks was like, well, wait a minute, we just spent this colossal amount of money. We did what we said we were going to do. Tell me what we're doing now. And it's like, well, we're just going to keep going back there. And the entire national consensus toward that unbelievably expensive program just fell completely apart. And there, the risk stuff was people were willing to, like, it was viewed as a great sacrifice when Apollo 8, when the astronauts of Apollo 8 died on the launch, and, terrible things happened, and they were heroes, sort of like military heroes who died for the country. But if you're going to spend that kind of money, taxpayer dollars, on Challenger or whatever, the demand for perfection sort of goes along with the national expenditure. It's like a national humiliation if the Challenger blows up and it turns out it was because of a piece of plastic that wasn't properly tested or something like that. There is no margin for, if it's private, the risk is taken on by investors, by personnel who are paid for this, and by the risk of, by going broke, right? I mean, if you have SpaceX and SpaceX goes bad, SpaceX goes out of business and everybody loses their shirts and everything goes haywire and nothing happens. That's the cost of, a private enterprise that is viewed as unreliable, unstable, or unsafe, or unworkable. And that's where we need that, it's like the assumption of risk. Rand Simberg's point, there is no assumption of risk if the federal government is paying for it. You're paying for 100% outcome. But, we're not implicated in whether or not SpaceX fails or succeeds. It's one of the reasons that Musk can be worth $100 billion, in part because of SpaceX or whatever he's worth. It's because he's assumed the risk, or he's talked people into giving him money to assume the risk. And all in all, that is a much safer and easier way to innovate, because every single American taxpayer isn't footing the bill, right? VCs are
Absolutely.
footing the bill.
And even when we're talking about missions where it's the federal government is sponsoring the mission and paying for the mission, but we're relying on private vendors like SpaceX to launch the rocket, and in cases with many other companies that NASA is working with, to build the lunar rover, to build the probe, to build the space telescope. Um, Imagine a world where all of that costs a tenth or a hundredth of what it costs today. So instead of sending up one like James Webb telescope that's cost billions and has been worked on for a decade, you can launch one every month. And, little ones, different ones, arrays. Instead of one, Perseverance rover on Mars, you could send up 40 and let them roam around. And if 2 or 3 of them break, it's not a big deal. If a couple of rockets don't make it, it's not a big deal. When we're talking about human missions, of course, the stakes are a lot higher. But if humans were going to the moon every couple of weeks, sooner or later, if something goes wrong, people are going to understand that better than if you wait years and years and years and years for the one mission, and then that goes wrong. Then that becomes a crisis. And I'm not belittling the value of human life, but I do think we need to recognize that space exploration is dangerous. It will continue to be dangerous, and there are people who are willing to face those dangers. But we need to be doing it much more frequently in order to have that kind of calculation make sense to people.
Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to make the last commentary recommends of the week, and I'm put in mind of this because we started playing science fiction and TV games, and because I've been watching, as I mentioned last week, an old show on Paramount Plus that was on AMC called Hell on Wheels, which is about the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad at the end of the Civil War, and this traveling town that goes along, tent city basically, that goes along as they are building the Union Pacific Railroad. And the show starts in Kansas as they are mapping the route through the Rockies to get to the ocean. And this haphazard classical sort of Deadwood style, or this community of barely civilized people, Civil War veterans. There are freed slaves, there are shanty Irish, there's a couple of depreding capitalists, hookers, and our hero is this Confederate soldier who had freed his own slaves, came home to find his wife had been raped and hanged and his son burned on his plantation. And his mission is to go find the Yankees who did this and kill them. And he's been going around America finding the people who did this to his wife, and ends up in this town, Hell on Wheels, as it's called, because he is actually on the hunt for his wife's murderers. And then he becomes the foreman of the project, and all sorts of hijinks ensue. And it's a great show. It's very brutal, but it's a great show. And its star is a guy named Anson Mount. And in another world, Anson Mount would be Clark Gable or something like that. He's incredibly good looking. He's incredibly charismatic. He's incredibly focused. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that he is 10 years after this, 10 years after the Hell on Wheels went off the air. I'm still in the second season. It ran for 4 or 5 seasons, and I don't even remember having heard of it at the time when it ran on AMC. He is the star of the latest Star Trek show on Paramount Plus, which is called Brave New Worlds. And he is fantastic on Brave New Worlds. 10 years older, he's a 50-year-old guy. And the story of Brave New Worlds is it's the mission just before Star Trek begins. So he is the captain Captain Pike that you see in the pilot episode of Star Trek, who has been through this terrible and is like a crippled, sort of like ruined person in this weird wheelchair getup, whom they go and try to save from these aliens. And the setup of Brave New Worlds is that he has had some weird temporal experience, Christopher Pike, in which he learns of his fate. He knows that 5 years down the road, he is going to end up in that chair, having had his body destroyed. And he nonetheless is running this mission on the Enterprise. How does he do it? He encounters the young Kirk. There's this whole young crew, and it's light and it's funny and it's clever. It's had 2 seasons. It's going to have a 3rd starting in June. It's the best, as far as I can tell. It's the best Star Trek series since, I don't know, forever. And this guy Anson Mount is like, like I say, in a different age, like Timothy Oliphant or Walton Goggins or something like that. You could see how these guys in the classical movie era would have been, Robert Mitchum, or as I say, or Gable, or one of those kinds of figures, charismatic, good looking, less is more, Steve McQueen types. And so I'm recommending Brave New Worlds. Again, optimistic vision, the classic Star Trek, how Star Trek did this to create this world of people who wanted to go do aerospace, is that it was this fundamentally optimistic idea that we were people going to go out into space and find out what was out there, because we had hopes that everybody was going to love peace and freedom, and we could learn from them and they could learn from us. And of course, almost all science fiction became dystopic after this, and is kind of a bummer. And this is back to kind of good cheer. So that's Brave New Worlds on Paramount Plus with Anson Mount. Go seek Anson Mount out. He's something. Jim Meigs, thank you so much as ever for your enlightening and an interesting commentary on all things commentary.
Well, it's always a pleasure, John.
Okay, and for Jim and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the caliber.